That's the most expensive mistake a boss ever made by refusing overtime pay. I joined a tiny startup in the early 2000s, the kind where everyone wore multiple hats and hoped the long hours would eventually turn into something meaningful. My salary was nothing special, but I loved the work. My contract said overtime wouldn't be paid, but the founders promised quarterly evaluations and a later adjustment once the company became stable. They also put in writing that a discretionary bonus would cover the overtime hours I had already worked. It wasn't legally back pay, but it served the same purpose. For 3 years, I pushed hard. I helped bring in 10 solid clients, built systems from scratch, and supported trial clients who were lining up to sign long-term contracts. Revenue was finally coming in, and talk about overtime compensation resurfaced. By internal estimates, I had about $50,000 worth of unpaid hours accumulated. The CEO acknowledged it in emails, assured me everything would be sorted out, and even floated the idea of offering equity if cash flow was tight. I was more than open to it. Real equity at a realistic valuation sounded great. But then the delays started. Slow, drawn-out conversations, canceled meetings, new excuses every month. It became obvious he was stalling. Finally, after almost a year of runaround, he invited me into a meeting to finalize the agreement. I walked in, expecting progress. Instead, he handed me an equity offer that felt like an insult written on company letterhead. He valued our 9-person company at hundreds of millions, far beyond anything grounded in reality, and offered me less than 0.01%. It was a way of saying, here's your compensation, technically. The moment I saw the paper, I understood exactly what he was doing. I also understood exactly what I would do next. I thanked him, stood up, and handed him my resignation. Because he had refused to update my contract earlier, I was still under the original terms. 1 month's notice plus a large amount of unused paid leave. Combined, that meant I didn't owe the company another minute of work. I packed my things and walked out the same day. The room went quiet, but no one said a word. They didn't need to. The next morning, I mailed a formal registered letter requesting my unpaid overtime, citing our written discussions. The reply arrived quickly, a complete refusal. I sent another registered letter, detailed, structured, citing dates, agreements, and acknowledgments. Another refusal. Their stance was simple. Bonuses were discretionary, and overtime did not exist. But I had already met with an attorney. The law placed the burden entirely on the employer, and with the email trail I had, the case was solid. As we reviewed the statutes together, I noticed something: a 7-year limitation period and a legally mandated interest rate of 9% above the central base rate. At that time, roughly 12% annually when compounded daily. So I asked the attorney, half joking, half serious, what happens if we wait? He looked at the numbers. If you're willing to risk the company still existing, the amount will grow significantly. I was willing. I sent one final letter to the company stating that I expected all owed and accrued amounts immediately. Nothing happened, so I waited. Life went on. I took a new job. The company I'd left continued to grow. They expanded, hired more people, and became known in the region. They had no idea the clock was ticking. Almost 7 years later, 6 years and 11 months after my final unpaid overtime entry, I contacted a new attorney and began the filing process. We gathered everything: emails, logs, registered letters, HR confirmations, and the original contract. The unpaid overtime, now combined with years of daily compounded interest, totaled around $112,000. Then came a detail I hadn't known earlier. The law.
If you're working overtime hours for a company, you'll be entitled to those payments. Do not let companies play around with you and offer you equity at an overpriced valuation or avoid paying altogether. Now, you might need to speak to an employment lawyer to make sure you know what your entitlements are and whether these hours actually fall under overtime entitlements. This is a common game. Companies often think that employees are exempt from overtime because they call them a manager even when they're not in substance, only in title, or because they're an annual salary employee, which does not usually disentitle you to overtime payments. So speak to an employment lawyer and make sure you know your rights like this poster did.